we went to a GP, our local GP. We talked to health visitors, and we were told that Edward was fine and he was just, quote unquote, a lazy baby, and he would develop in his own pace. And then he went at 7 weeks old into respiratory arrest, and my partner had to revive him in the back of the car.
Welcome to Innovating Healthcare by Chamber. Today we're focusing on rare diseases in response to the Rare Disease Day, and I'm pleased to be joined by an excellent panel that I'll come to in a second. My name is Meg Bewick. I'm a former National Deputy Medical Director at NHS England, and I remember back to 2016 with the launch of the then Rare Disease Policy by Lord Howe, and I had the nerve-wracking response of responding to it. And it's really interesting to see what has happened in that intervening 6 years. If you want to join the conversation, by the way, you can do so through using the hashtag Innovating Healthcare. And we're aiming to get as wide a response to this as we can and as wide an audience as we can to what is a truly important subject for the future. I'd like the panel now to introduce themselves. And I think it's appropriate that we start with a family, and particularly a patient who's sitting on the knee opposite me, young Ed, and his mother, Meg. And Meg, would you introduce yourself, please? And then we'll come back to your experiences later.
Yep. Hi, I'm Meg Willis. This is Edward Willis. And Edward has SMA type 1, and I'm his mother.
Right, yeah. And would you just say what SMA is?
Yep. So it's spinal muscular atrophy. Shall I go into what SMA actually what it is?
No, you can leave that just for now. We'll come back to the sort of science of it later if you don't mind.
No,
but yeah, and Ed, you're very, very welcome to join us today. Thank you. And you've been a really good boy, I have to say. So we're going to move on over here to Simon Meadowcroft. Would you like to just explain your role, Simon?
Absolutely. I'm Simon Meadowcroft. I'm Medical Director for Takeda across the UK and Ireland. And we have a range of medicines in rare diseases, both available today and in development.
And Lauren Watson.
I'm Lauren Watson, and I'm the Rare Disease Policy Lead in the Department of Health and Social Care, and our team has had responsibility for developing the England Rare Diseases Action Plan.
And Professor Joanne Hackett.
Hello, I'm Joanne Hackett, and I am the Head of Genomic and Precision Medicine at IQVIA.
And lastly, our second Lauren Roberts.
Hi, I'm Lauren Roberts, and I'm the Joint Interim Chief Executive of Genetic Alliance UK. We are the largest alliance of organisations in the UK that support people with rare genetic and undiagnosed conditions, and we also run the Rare Disease UK campaign.
Absolutely lovely. I just want to start really with, and with the family, as we say. My experience as a former GP and a former hospital doctor, as well as roles in the NHS, were that often policies are thought out with patients coming second rather than at the centre of this. And I'd just like you to reflect on your experience of going through that diagnostic process and discovering Ed's problem and what has happened since then.
So Edward was diagnosed at 11 weeks old. We started noticing symptoms at about 4 weeks. To be honest, we went to a GP, our local GP. We talked to health visitors, and we were told that Edward was fine and he was just, quote unquote, a lazy baby, and he would develop in his own pace. And then he went at 7 weeks old into respiratory arrest, and my partner had to revive him in the back of the car. So Edward was, he was unresponsive, blue, floppy. And that's when we went to a specialist centre, and he was in a coma for a week. And when he woke up, we noticed that he was completely floppy, like a doll. There was just no tone whatsoever. And it just kind of went from 0 to 1,000 very, very quickly. And we saw a neurologist, and the neurologist came down, and we saw the lead neurologist, and that's when SMA was first kind of mentioned. Edward was just displaying all of the symptoms of SMA, so hypnosia, he couldn't hold his head at all, he was rapid breathing, belly breathing, and a very weak cry. So yeah, that was kind of our story in a nutshell. And then he was put on to nusinersen at 11 weeks. So it was very, very rapid. But I do have to say, that's not a regular story. We were extremely lucky that he had a respiratory arrest and managed to get an early diagnosis. Lots of families in the community, they take months to be diagnosed. It's lots of knocking on people's doors and being told the same old story, unfortunately, that children develop and not knowing the signs of something so severe like SMA until you get to a specialist centre.
And I'm going to come on now with in terms of what is a rare disease, and Lauren, perhaps you'd like to just explicitly define it, and then we'll come to perhaps the implications of that.
Sure. So rare diseases are those diseases that affect fewer than 1 in 2,000 people. And so they can range from ones that we might have all heard of, like Huntington's disease, right down to the ultra rare conditions that affect 1 in a million. And although rare diseases are actually considered individually rare, collectively they affect about 3.5 million people in the UK, and it's estimated that about 1 in 17 people will be affected by a rare disease in their lifetime, which is why it's so important that people with rare diseases get the best possible treatment and care, and why we've been developing policy in this regard through the Rare Diseases Framework and England's Action Plan.
Yeah, and during this discussion, I'd like to come on to policy later. I think we'd probably all like to, as well as reflect on some of the experiences people have, look at where the science is going with this. So, Joanne, I just wonder whether you could tell us what has changed in the last few years that has meant that rare diseases have come to the fore, and what are we doing differently now in terms of diagnosis, etc.
Sure. So I think it's a really humbling story to hear what you've had to go through. And I think one of the things that very few people realize is that we didn't have the amount of data that we have today to be able to make these diagnoses a lot faster. It's not that there are smarter people looking at individuals and there are more people coming forward. It's just we now have a lot more data than we had. And if you think about trying to find patterns, unless you have a huge amount of reference points, it's really, really difficult to be able to find things that repeat. And I think the way that we're moving into this era is that we're now finally able to have that tipping point, that we have enough data to be able to find patterns. And also we've got really great pharmaceuticals that are now actually addressing these very, very specific genetic diseases. So it's really that combination of the acceleration of genomics and precision medicine with the acceleration of tailored drug discovery as well.
And Lauren, do you think this is having an impact on policy decisions that people are coming to?
Absolutely. I think we, as part of the policy developments that we've been doing, we've been listening very closely to a range of stakeholders, including industry, including healthcare professionals, and most importantly, people's lived experience of rare conditions. And I think this is definitely shaping the policy and also shaping the innovations that we can harness to really bring about positive change for people with rare conditions.
During COVID, we heard a lot about the improved relationships between the pharmaceutical industry, technology industry, and health services. And Sam, I just wonder, in terms of where we're going with rare diseases, has that had benefits that you're seeing now? And are you making sure that in the industry has got a good response to this and is looking at these sort of
I think
ultra rare diseases often as well?
Yeah, I think you're right that the climate has changed a little bit with COVID, and people have seen what the pharmaceutical industry have been able to bring to the table. But I think we need to be, honest here and accept that folks with rare diseases have had a fairly difficult time over the years. Meg talked about a relatively rapid diagnosis in Ed's situation, but acknowledged the fact that that's not common. Patients are often getting passed from pillar to post, and with some conditions it can be many years before they actually get a diagnosis. And when they get a diagnosis, in a lot of cases, there's no treatments available. But I think things are much more positive now. At about the turn of the century, we started seeing the regulators in both the States and Europe bringing some incentives to play, particularly around extended patent lives, which mean that it's much more commercially viable to invest in research in developing treatments for rare diseases. And if you look back 20 years, you know, I think between 2000 and 2005, there were about 20 medicines for rare diseases licensed. We're now running at about 20 medicines per year. But there's still a long way to go here. 95% of patients, when they're diagnosed with a rare disease, find that there is no licensed and effective treatment there. And, you know, this is very much a partnership approach as well. Probably in rare diseases more than in other areas, but we cannot develop medicines without strong partnerships with healthcare professionals who really understand the diseases, who help us design the trials, who run the trials in their clinic and help recruit patients. I think regulators, payers and the pharmaceutical industry have really got wise to the fact that we need to engage much more with patients and patient groups, because patients and their mums and dads and carers, they're the ones who need to be telling us what is it in terms of outcomes that a treatment needs to provide for it to be a successful treatment in a particular therapy area. There's a lot of collaboration on that front, a lot of collaboration with academia. And if you know, it's quite fascinating. If you look at the story on a lot of these medicines, it'll be, there was a scientific breakthrough made in the academic sector. There was a biotech firm who actually started, you know, developing drugs once that enabling bit of science had been done. You then find that a bigger pharmaceutical company was involved in running the clinical trials in very close collaboration with healthcare professionals and patients. So there's a lot of stakeholders at play before a drug gets to the point of actually being commercialised.
So if I can just take us a bit further about the patient involvement, and both Laurens, really, we'll start with you now. Do you think in the current climate that there is enough input going in from patients into the design of new treatments and perhaps better diagnostic pathways?
I think there could always be more. One of the questions that we get asked a lot by any of the groups that we support is almost the step before that, which is how do you get people to do research on your trials? How do you get the clinical trials to happen? So I think that's something that a lot of patient groups are really pushing for. And then I think just involving everyone as soon as you can, so they can also tell you about some of the ways that trials can fail. So we've had conversations with some of our member groups where, you know, they'd kind of got to the point of having these big trials and, you know, the hope was there, but actually really kind of practical things about the way the trial was set up meant that they couldn't take part or they couldn't get their community involved. So I think the more you have dialogue with the patient groups right from the start, the more likely there is to be success for the trials.
Of course, a day like Rare Disease Day helps push that forward and identify to the populations that are at risk of that. And it's very interesting what you're saying about 1 in 17 or 1 in, I thought it was slightly higher than that in truth, but it will be affected by some condition like this. So it's not that infrequent a diagnosis. The specific diagnosis is infrequent, but the diagnosis of a rare disease actually is not that uncommon. And for a policymaker like yourselves, is it something that is going to be embedded into policy, do you think, in terms of patient experience and early on?
Absolutely. I think we the action plan that we've just published on Rare Disease Day actually is the practical application of the UK Rare Diseases framework. And one of the underpinning themes that we've got in the framework is, as it's termed there, patient voice, really listening to people's lived experience. And that's threaded through the development of our policy up until this point. And one of the things that we're really keen to do is involve the rare diseases community in developing measures to see whether the policy that we've developed is actually making a difference. So beyond just input into what we would like to see happen, it's going to be input into, has this actually happened, and how can we take this further and improve and develop a policy that better meets those diverse needs in the future.
Okay, there's this idea of this new shining light, a shining ally. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that's involving patient immunity?
Yeah, so this was part of our celebrations for Rare Disease Day, which was yesterday. And so it was a partnership with ITN Productions to produce a digital news item called Shining a Light on Rare Conditions. And actually it was touching on a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, the way that science and technology is offering real kind of hope for the community. So we had a news item actually which was about SMA, but particularly around the need for newborn screening and the need for newborn screening to be expanded in the UK, because we currently screen for far less conditions than some of our European counterparts. But also just looking at all of the different, the advent of genomics and the advent of medication and the use of big data and how this can really improve conditions, things for people with rare conditions.
And I think back to my own practice, one of the most frustrating things was not being able to make an accurate diagnosis, especially in a child that was obviously struggling. And I just wondered if we could come, perhaps, Joe, to you, where do you see that changing now? You talked a lot about the amount of data we have and the genomics exposure we have.
Yes, and I think that is actually one of the things that it gives me great hope to be able to hear that you had a diagnosis in such a short period of time, and reflecting on the fact that that is not actually the norm, and even wasn't the norm probably even 5 years ago. I think the reason that we are seeing such a shift, and the reason why it is quite exciting, is because there's more and more healthcare systems that are starting to realize that preventative medicine, and is okay, fine, we're not saying that necessarily everyone gets newborn screened, perhaps that is something that's going to happen, but moving the diagnosis early and earlier is much more important than it has been before. There used to always be this discussion as to whether or not we pay for prevention, and really the only thing that people actually pay for is vaccines. Well, I think we've just seen how effective that was, investing in that. So the more we can actually think about the screening programs, and the more that we can start to think about real-world data as well. So when you talked earlier, Simon, about trying to get an awareness about the outcomes and how individuals are understanding the reactions to different medications, you don't necessarily tell your GP whether or not your child wet the bed or had a seizure in the middle of the night, but parents know that. So how can we collect that information, and how can that information help us make better diagnoses? Not every place in the world is going to have a newborn screening program. Can we be better at looking at the phenotypic characteristics? As you said, you would like to diagnose a patient that's struggling. If you only had clinical information and not genetic, how can we start to marry that? So there's an explosion of this, and I think the other benefit of the recent pandemic is the fact that people are much more aware of their own health now and want to contribute. So contributing that real world data, contributing outcome measures is so important, and it's now being much more cohesive. So I think it's very promising.
Would you reflect that that's actually happening now?
Absolutely, yeah. I think one of our priorities as part of the action plan is on faster diagnosis. And as part of that, we're looking at ways to improve decision making on newborn screening, which involves better evidence gathering, but also expanding starting to look at ways that we can use genomic technologies for screening in newborns. But as you say, it's not all about newborn screening, and there are many people who were still waiting for diagnosis many years after the newborn phase, and we're working with the NHS on ways to expand the test directory for genomics. Also looking at the clinical research interface. So Genomics England is particularly interested in looking at how data that researchers generate can be fed back into the NHS to really inform practice. And we're also working with the NHS to look at a multidisciplinary way of approaching trying to help people who are still waiting for a diagnosis many years later. But I think it's also, Genetic Alliance published a report on good diagnosis on Rare Disease Day, and I think it's important to reflect on the fact that a good diagnosis is not only fast, but also that people are supported throughout that diagnostic journey, and I think that's a really important part of it as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And I think it's important that we realise that from an industry point of view, the amount of research and development you need to put into an individual drug is just so immense. How are you developing new tools, new drugs that can help us in these sort of advanced therapies, Simon, and the precision nature that Joe was talking about?
Yeah, so I think fundamental to all this is understanding the biological basis of the disease that you're dealing with, and huge advances have been made in that area. And actually in rare diseases, you've got quite a lot of conditions where there's a single genetic defect, which provides you with really quite an attractive target for therapy. You know, if somebody's missing a particular gene, then they're not coding a particular protein, actually replacing the gene or replacing the protein can be a very attractive target. So once the basic science is understood, you really start work on delivering the therapy into the patient's cells. And this is leading to big advances in technology such as gene therapy and the like. So I think gene therapy is a big area really in a lot of these rare diseases, particularly those that are characterized by a sort of single gene problem. But of course there's developing the treatments, but as we've talked about previously, you've also got to diagnose these patients. And advances in diagnostics and being able to apply those diagnostics early are really critical. Because in quite a lot of the diseases we're dealing with, and I can think of diseases where we're working, actually it's really important that you treat before the damage has been done to the patient. So early diagnosis where possible through the sort of newborn screening heel prick test. Where that's not possible, early identification of symptoms. Some of the panel testing I think that you've mentioned is really useful. So, I may be a pediatric neurologist, I haven't really got a clue what type of epilepsy or what the biological basis for epilepsy in this child is. And that's actually going to be quite difficult for me to work out in routine practice. But I can sort of select a panel of genetic tests which may just give me the answer and may enable me to start treatments earlier than would previously have been the case.
Do you think the pathways that we've got at present take into account some of the frustrations that patients have of not accessing some of the modern treatments that may be available in other countries? And maybe Lauren, I'll ask you to answer that first.
Again, this is something that we're looking at through the Rare Diseases Framework and Action Plan around the priority in improving access to specialist care, treatment and drugs. And I think there is an appreciation of the fact that sometimes the landscape can be quite difficult to navigate, and that there are quite a few different steps and challenges that face rare disease medicines in particular. So one of the specific actions that we're partnering with NHS England on is mapping the uptake of medicines against what would be expected based on the patient population, and looking at this across England to see whether there are any geographic inequalities, because that's something that we bear in mind as well, is trying to make sure that this access is rapid, but that it's also equitable.
And Simon, perhaps you can comment on that, particularly around things like the Innovation Fund.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a number of different hurdles, as you mentioned. There's for some medicines, it's simply demonstrating cost effectiveness through the NICE process. I say simply, but that's actually quite complex. In other areas, of course, you need complete service redesign. If you've got a disease that hasn't previously had targeted therapy, and a targeted therapy arrives, often the infrastructure to provide that and manage those patients isn't in place. I mean, I think there's two things in the access environment that are hot topics at the moment. One is the NICE Methods Review. It's coming to a conclusion. And the other is the Innovative Medicines Fund. I think Takeda share concern expressed, I've heard, by a lot of the industry around, not a huge amount of ambition, frankly, shown in the NICE Methods Review to date. However, there are some wins here for rare diseases that we need to acknowledge. So firstly, there's a disease severity modifier been introduced, and I think that quite rightly reflects the real importance of providing treatments and funding treatments for those diseases which have the greatest negative impact on people's lives. I think that's really critical. I think there's also at least an aspiration for NICE to be more flexible in the face of uncertainty. The value of treatments in rare diseases is harder to ascertain precisely than in common conditions, simply because very few patients, very small trials, inevitably equals uncertainty in outcome. I think the Innovative Medicines Fund is really interesting, and obviously it's an extension of the previous Cancer Drugs Fund outside of oncology. And we're supportive of this. I mean, this means that there's a mechanism now to essentially have medicines funded for a period post-license where the data is perhaps quite ambiguous and there's quite a lot of uncertainty, but where you're expecting further data and, to the point earlier, potentially real-world evidence to better clarify the genuine value of the drug. So essentially you get a price now based on slightly, quite a bit of uncertainty, and then as the uncertainty gets clarified, you get a new price based on sort of more solid data, and that's really useful. One area we are concerned, and we think that the payers need to really address, is around the ongoing commitment to fund these drugs. So the expectation in oncology has always been, if you get money through the Cancer Drugs Fund, patients who are on the drug, you will continue to supply that drug free of charge as long as it's required, if NICE ultimately don't fund the medicine. Now, in oncology, patients are often on drugs for relatively limited periods of time, and that's probably reasonable. Challenge in rare diseases, of course, is if NICE say no and you've got patients on drug, you could be open to having to fund free drug for a whole lifetime. Some of these drugs are actually just the manufacturing costs are very high. And whilst you might say for a company like Takeda or one of the other major pharma companies, you've got the revenues to kind of manage that. In rare diseases, there's quite a lot of drugs being introduced by pretty small biotechs who maybe only have one or two drugs. And I am concerned that unless this changes, are they really going to be willing to sign up to that sort of open-ended commitment?
It must be about, I think, 4 or 5 years now since Sir John Bell produced his industrial strategy, which was heavily focused on biotechnologies. And Joe, when you were talking in your introduction around during COVID, that sort of look at what we got back from intensive innovation at the time to producing world-class, as it was called, vaccines, and the government was, politicians were backing that to the hill. People lose focus on rare diseases fairly quickly once they've talked about them, because the backlogs of care that have mounted up over the past few years are in the forefront of their minds at the moment. How are we going to keep that rolling so that sort of biochemical and biotechnological breakthroughs are actually going to be used in a way to support our economies as well? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there's a big part of it, as you mentioned previously, people are really interested in trying to get the best result as quickly as possible, and you don't want to be knocking on 100 doors to try to get a diagnosis. We know there are faster ways of doing it. So I think there's going to be demand by all of us as citizens and patients. We are all patients at the end of the day. There's going to be a demand from that side, but also we keep talking about rare diseases when, 10 years ago, we used the word epilepsy to describe 13 manifestations. So sometimes rare diseases really aren't all that rare. It's a common disease that's being broken down the more you understand the science. And this goes back to the data piece. So the more we can collect data, the more we can understand what we're actually looking at. You may not actually have a complex disorder. You may have a rare disease that's sitting underneath something that we think is common. So we are moving towards, I think, a much more ambitious society where people want to take ownership and they don't want to be waiting around for 11 weeks. And if it is something that can be changed very quickly, and there's a lot of innovative ways to do this, and we're not talking rocket science, we're talking sometimes a digital innovation, e-consent, sending a kit to somebody's house. We're super proficient now about being able to send COVID tests to people's houses, and you can do a lateral flow. Why can't you do that for a blood draw to get a genetic test done? And it's also a lot cheaper now to do the genetic diagnosis than it was before. So I think it's innovation both on the cost and the use of some of these technologies, and also the way that us citizens as a whole are demanding a different type of healthcare.
And coming back to that patient experience and family experience, you highlighted at the beginning, yours was a relatively rapid diagnosis, and you're probably part of groups now where their experience may not have been as effective, maybe in the early stage. How do you think that the health service, and particularly those clinicians who are responsible for diagnostic, should change to sort of help this?
I think it's all about training. It's not the specialist centres, it's the local trusts that need to pick up the signs early. Like I said before, it was very rapid, Edward's diagnosis. Unfortunately, he had to have something so severe as I was about to say cardiac arrest, which he didn't have a cardiac arrest, a respiratory arrest. It's just picking up the signs. I know it's a very tight-knit community, the SMA community, and 95% of people go months without a diagnosis. They, again, knock on health visitors' doors, GPs, go to a specialist centre and still being undiagnosed, not seeing the signs. again, I think it's all about a checklist, training, and spotting the signs very early.
If I was back in my old GP chair, I'd say that with the number of rare diseases out there, it's impossible for me to have a knowledge of the vast majority of them. What I think you're really indicating, it's if there are concerns in a family that you're not answering, it requires that you find someone who can answer it. And I think that's just a humbling, not a humbling of their position, it's actually just giving them a pathway so they can get to an early diagnosis. And coming back to Joe's point about why don't we interact with the population in a different way and give them some responsibility for actually being involved in that diagnostic pathway, it might actually lighten the load rather than increase the load.
I mean, one of the symptoms of SMA is hypnosia, which is a symptom to many rare diseases and quite severe diseases. And that really should have been picked up because he was displaying symptoms quite early on with hypnosia. I mean, from birth, I would say he's never had head control until he went on to gene therapy. So even if, SMA is very rare, I mean, it is 1 in 10,000, so it is one of the more common rare diseases. But all of the checklists, you might not know what SMA is, but common signs like hypnosia, floppy baby, where they can't lift their head, I feel like, really should have been picked up and at least deferred on to a specialist centre.
I've done a lot of work with neonatal specialists, and they would probably back that completely. And the general training of many doctors outside paediatrics, in paediatrics, is not extensive. But there are certain key elements that we could perhaps teach a little bit better, both undergraduates and postgraduate doctors, and obviously other clinicians that are with them. Is this affecting policy, do you think, these sort of frustrating stories that are coming?
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the priorities of our England Rare Diseases Action Plan as well, and exactly this, raising awareness amongst healthcare professionals of rare diseases more broadly, recognizing that people can't necessarily be experts in 7,000 conditions, but what they can do is know what to look for and where to look to get the advice that they need. So we've been working very closely with Health Education England on these points, and they're developing digital tools that'll put rare disease information at GPs' fingertips, integrating into the software and programs that doctors already use to access information. So they'll be able to find just-in-time accessible resources that'll help with patient management. Health Education England is looking at what information to include in training curricula, and also expanding their genomics education program beyond genetic rare conditions to also look at non-genetic rare conditions. So I think although approximately 80% of rare conditions have an identified genetic basis, there's of course 20% that still need our support. And so that's been part of the work that's ongoing, and they've actually launched an online hub for rare disease information, which went live on Rare Disease Day. Which is very exciting and contains a lot of very useful information, which is targeted at healthcare professionals as well.
And how is industry helping closing that gap, between the diagnostic gap, if you like?
Yeah, so I think as we develop drugs, quite early actually in the development pathway, we're looking to understand how patients are managed in the system. And really, you find the problems and then you address them. So in many instances, there's an educational gap to the point you were making. And actually, we're working with groups like, we're collaborating at the moment with a group called Medics for Rare Diseases, which is a great group aimed at providing better training for doctors, not so that as a GP and, as a former GP myself, I don't think I could ever diagnose SMA, but so that you realize when when the facts aren't matching up to the provisional diagnosis you've made, and you realise this patient actually needs referring on to somebody who's more specialist and needs referring on quickly. So there's an educational piece in there, which I think is really important. There's working with the healthcare system to redesign services when that's required, because if you've got a condition where there previously was no effective treatment, now there is an effective treatment, you'll probably need a very differently designed service. You need to find ways to get patients through that. You'll need to bring together people from multiple disciplines, looking at a couple of areas where, for example, drugs need to be given into the central nervous system, what's called intrathecal infusions. Now, that needs a neurosurgeon who's capable of putting sort of pumps in, and that technology needs managing, as well as the paediatrician who's managing the rare disease itself. And making sure there are companion diagnostic tests available as well, so that when there is an index of suspicion that a patient's got a condition, the testing can be made available quite quickly.
And now I'm going to ask the most difficult question of all, because there's only one answer each, which is, in closing this discussion today, what message, a single message, would you like to give at the end of Rare Disease Day? And Meg, perhaps I could start with you.
What message? Well, as a mother, I would like to say that there is life after a diagnosis, especially now with the new technologies and with gene therapy. I mean, I wish I could go back to myself a year ago and give myself a cuddle and just say it's all going to be okay. And so there is life after a diagnosis, and your world implodes when you have, especially such a rare disease like SMA, and you have no idea what it is. No one knows. And 5 years ago, the information online is quite inaccurate to actually what it is now. I mean, I was given a letter to say that Edward wouldn't survive 2 years. So he's 18 months now. And medicine has come on in such a long way in such a short space of time. We've now got gene therapy, and it really has changed my son's life, and changed the outlook of his life. And he's now got a life where he didn't when he was first diagnosed. So my message would be just, it's going to be okay. And medicine is just advancing so rapidly that, that's kind of, does that make sense?
That's a very optimistic.
I feel like I mumbled that, but.
That's a very optimistic note, isn't it? But you did highlight one thing there. I think it's important, the support you need after a diagnosis, because you're looking at yourself in the mirror and thinking, what is happening to me, isn't it? You want to do that. So, Lauren, in terms of a more general, for the whole host of rare diseases out there, what would you like to happen in the next year which will help those the most?
I think it could be quite easily summed up, actually, and it's something that Medics for Rare push a lot with. They're just think rare, because I think there's so much happening, as we've been talking about, that's offering so much opportunity and hope for the rare community. But it's that first point of getting into that system, whether it's the new genomic medicine system or whether it's the framework and the action plan. The structure's in place, but the patients have to get there. And if there's still that sort of unintentional gatekeeping through lack of awareness or just lack of knowledge at the ground level with those first point of contact healthcare professionals, I think the training there and just getting it embedded in everyone's mind to think rare first, so that we can get people through the system to really benefit from everything we've been talking about.
And Joe.
For me, it's about collaboration. I think we've heard this from both sides, both the lived experience and from the charity side. We can't do this alone, and it has to be a combination of sharing information. How do we get more real-world data? How do we understand that this is a global phenomenon? We can't solve everything in one particular country. So genetics is global. I know not all rare diseases are genetic, but it comes down to collaboration.
I think from the policy side, we just want to say thank you so much to the rare disease community for collaborating with us on the publication of England's Rare Disease Action Plan on Rare Disease Day. We've been humbled and we've been privileged to listen to the stories that people have shared so generously of their personal experiences of rare conditions. And we're really looking forward to working closely with stakeholders across the board, and most importantly, people with living with rare conditions, going forward to make sure that we ensure that this policy is as effective as possible and leads to real change for people living with rare conditions.
That's fine.
So rare diseases aren't that rare. I was going to talk about the 1 in 17 stat, but you beat me to it. That means that most of us will have a family member or a close friend who's affected by a rare disease at some point. And the last 20 years, I think, have shown us that investment in treatments for rare diseases can yield, a steady stream of life-transforming therapies.
Well, thank you all for your contribution today. I've learned so much today, and I hope the audience out there will enjoy it as much as I have. Thank you again.
Thank you.